Hello, I'm Dr. LaDonna Osborn, and I'm presenting episode 2 of the Daisy Washburn Osborn 100 Years of Life, Ministry, Influence. In 2024, my mother would have turned 100 years old. She passed in 1995, but her legacy continues, her influence, dramatic influence from her life. Now, often, her story has not been told because the story of my mother and father as a couple doing the ministry has really overshadowed the story, the pieces of her early life. So the purpose of these episodes, especially these first segments, is to introduce you to her on a more personal level, talking to you as her daughter, reflecting on the things she told me. And these are important pieces of her life that she would often just talk way into the night, sharing these things with me. Now, I'm sharing these with you because I believe as we deal with children, it's helpful to have an example like this that teaches us to not give up on children. I told you in the first episode that she was born into a very depraved, poverty-stricken, godless environment. It was a lot of fear, a lot of superstition, a lot of anger, a lot of violence, a lot of the things that are just the opposite of what a child needs. She was the 10th of 11 children. And I've told you that when she was 8 years old, she lost her mother and an older sister in an automobile train accident. And this was the beginning of a real transition in my mother's life. In the state of California, the government decides what happens to orphaned children. Now, they hadn't lost their father yet, but he was a drunkard. He was a man that was violent, and the state determined that he could not care for his children. So the older boys just began living on the street. The older girls just started managing their lives the best they could. But my mother was taken by the state of California and put in an orphan environment. And it happens, and this is a piece of the God miracle that I love to reflect on. My mother had an older half-sister. Her name was Ruby, and it's a complete additional story to talk about Ruby, her story, and how that interacted with my mother. I don't have time to tell that story in these episodes, but Ruby had married a Christian. Ruby was 20 years older than my mother. She had married a man who knew Christ, and so Ruby had accepted the Lord. And so when Ruby went to the state of California, asked to take her half-sister, the state said yes. And so Ruby became, we might call it today, a foster home. It was more like that. It wasn't that she adopted my mother or anything very official, but she was a kind of next of kin. Now, what was interesting to me is that my mother at 8 years old, remember the environment that she was raised in, the violent environment, she had, by her own admission, she had a violent temper. And she loved her mother. She was devoted to her mother, and she resented this half-sister who had taken her because my mother was thinking, this woman's trying to be my replacement mother. You've dealt with children like this who, for one reason or another, are difficult because they don't want a new authority figure in their lives. Well, this was my mother. And so she resented Ruby. She tried, I'm sure she made Ruby's life tough, but Ruby was a Christian. And she was full of love, full of wisdom, and she dealt with my mother in some very significant ways. Number one, from the time my mother went to live with Ruby and her family, they were in church every Sunday. I don't remember my mother ever saying that she resented that. She must have enjoyed the atmosphere of church. I'm guessing that. But she went every Sunday. And when my mother was 12 years old, she was wonderfully born again. They had a revival at her church, and she would tell us the preacher preached on hell and scared it out of her. But she gave her life completely to Jesus. She really fell in love with Jesus. And it was shortly after that that she was baptized in the Holy Spirit. I'm saying this because it was at that event in her life that her temper was dealt with. This is an encouragement to us who deal with adults, youth, children who have these emotional problems because of life. The Holy Spirit is a restorer. He's a healer. He comes in our lives and he puts things in perspective. He bends. He puts things right. And so this was my mother's testimony. From the time she was baptized in the Holy Spirit, she did not have a temper problem. I never saw her angry. She was just always peaceful, always calm. And so, of course, I thank the Lord for that. Now, there was something that happened at her home church. This is significant. A missionary came to their church who was a missionary in India. And it happened that the missionary needed a volunteer she wanted to dress a child up with Indian clothes, just kind of as a demonstration. So my mother volunteered, and she went up, and the missionary draped an Indian sari all around her, and she stood there in Indian clothes. Now, the story will continue. You that have been following the story of my father's 100 years, you'll remember the drama of their early ministry in India. So here was a seed planted in my mother. Halfway across the United States, complete different environment, and yet India became a seed in her heart. Just look at what God can do. We never know. This is your takeaway from this episode. We never know what seed being planted in the life of a child is going to have an effect on their destiny throughout life. Keep this in mind, because a kind word to a child, a compliment, just a recognition, a word of encouragement, just to recognize them, listen to them. What a difference it makes. And my mother is a testimony to that wonderful ability that we have to influence children. So I want to encourage you that as we go through this year, celebrating Daisy Washburn Osborn's 100 years of life, ministry, influence, I want you to come away from the Daisy Osborn you know now, the end of her life, and come back to those childhood years, and let's see what we can learn. And I want to tell you overall, God doesn't give up on people. He has a way of rescuing the most impossible person to be useful in his kingdom. God bless you. I'll see you the next episode.